So welcome to the best session. And we'll see. My name is Gregory Touretsky. I'm a Senior Director of Product Management at Seagate. And I'm doing something that not many people know about Seagate. We have launched our own cloud storage a couple of years ago, where we are offering S3 compatible object storage as a service. So we have customers who don't want to pay a lot of money to Amazon or others, and then they come and store data on us and pay for consumption. So something very unusual for Seagate, right? It's not like typical hard drives company. We build service, we sell service, provide support to customers. And I'm not going to talk about this in the slides, so just as an intro. And explanation why we actually care about S3. So what we're going to talk about today is S3, what it is, what challenges are there, and how customers struggle with that, and if we can do something to help them. And obviously S3 is defined, it's coming from Amazon. There is one company that drives the definition of this protocol, and many others who claim to be S3 compatible. Right? Is it some kind of a myth, or is it a real thing? Let's look at that. So first of all, looking on Amazon S3, I'm sure everybody knows about that, but just some history. This was one of the two first services offered by Amazon. This is part of the blog post that came out in March 2006, announcing S3 availability. So they have quite a runtime. And earlier this year, they celebrated 17 years of S3 and published some statistics, right? Over 280 trillion objects, stored over 100 million requests per second that are served by S3 in Amazon. Very impressive. Probably the largest storage system in the world. If we look on the S3 API, right, and all the claims about S3 API compatibility, it is a very feature-rich and very complex set of APIs. It's built on top of the standard REST APIs, GET, POST, PUT, and so on. But if we look on the S3 API specification, there are over 90 different API requests. Then there are additional, what they call the S3 control actions, and there are additional 60 plus actions that are kind of S3 extensions in a way. And there are additional things that are related, not exactly part of S3 API, but there are additional APIs that are related for access management, identity management, temporary access, and so on. So the amount of actions that have to be supported to really claim S3 compatibility is very significant, and in reality, nobody supports all of them other than Amazon. So there are many different players who provide S3 compatible storage. Some companies who provide managed service, like obviously Amazon, Backblaze, Wasabi, Seagate, and others. And there are companies that are offering the on-premises solutions, whether it's IBM or Dell or Cloudian. There are also a couple of open source implementations with Ceph and Min.io. Everybody is claiming S3 compatibility. Let's look into basically to what extent they're doing that. So first of all, nobody, even though from the marketing point of view, many vendors are claiming compatibility, if you go to their website, you'll likely find some kind of what is not supported page. Right, so those are the official incompatibilities. If you go to IBM or Scalability or Min.io, they explain what they don't support. And that makes sense, right? Some of them even add things. So like, here's an example from Dell where they extend the S3 API. There are some things that they do not support, but there are some things that they invent on their own. And then it becomes another kind of flavor of S3. Some features that they add that others do not support. So those are kind of official incompatibilities. Then how those vendors who develop S3, and by the way, This list that I was talking about here, it's all server implementations. There are also client implementations. If you look on any application that is out there that supports S3, they have to implement the client side of the S3 API, and that leads to additional things of kind of flavors of the implementation and compatibility issues. So how they test this compatibility? There is nothing available from Amazon. Amazon obviously have their own set of tests that they use internally, but they're not publicly available. So every vendor has some homegrown set of tools for API compatibility. There is a great contribution made by the Ceph team with the S3 compatibility tests that are used by pretty much everyone to some extent. There are some variations of those tests coming with from Splunk and OpenIO. There is another set of tests coming from MinIO called Mint, which is looking more not only to the S3 API compatibility, but also to support of the various SDKs that are available, but those are not comprehensive. And here's an interesting fact. If I run Mint, this is a MinIO tool, against different endpoints and check what they found, right? So MinIO is 0 test fail. If I run this against Backblaze, 14 tests fail. Google, 15. Amazon, 12. So apparently MinIO is more S3 compatible than Amazon, based on this test. Right. So let's look into this kind of into more details and understand what is included in S3 API. So first of all, if I want to understand what is actually, what endpoint I'm working with, what is the implementation of the S3 that I'm talking to, I can query the endpoint, right? I can use it with the API and read a particular header that is returned. I can do it with AWS CLI and look for the response headers and look for the response header called server. And I can, in most of the cases, I can see what is the actual implementation of the S3 API that I'm talking to, right? It could be Amazon S3. If I query Google, it returns upload server for whatever reason, but that's what they define. Ceph does not define anything. Wasabi is actually taking it further. You can likely see here not only the fact that it's Wasabi, you can also see the version of Wasabi application that is running there, and looks like you can also see the actual server, the S3 server that you are talking to, and so on. So that's one thing that might be interesting when you're exploring what kind of endpoint you're working with. What else in general is included in the request, right? So we said that any API request in S3 is built on top of REST API. So let's explore one example. There is an S3 API request called upload part. This is part of the mechanism to send a large object to S3. You can basically break it down to multiple parts and upload them one by one, and then the S3 backend will rebuild them into a single object. So if you look on the upload part API action, it is based on REST API put request, right? I'm uploading a single part. And the parameters that I need to specify here, what is the bucket name, right? The host endpoint that I'm talking to. I need to provide the object name, what is the number of this part, the upload ID, the authorization string, and something that is typically provided here is user agent. Basically, what application is used here to provide this particular data. In this example of the request that I was looking into, this is coming from Cumulo S3 application. But yeah, it can be anything, and it's very helpful as well. So for me as a storage vendor or a cloud provider, it helps to understand what applications are used by my customers and ensure the optimization of the backend to work better with those applications. So if you implement the client side, make sure you define user agent. If you implement the server side, you check what user agents are used by your clients. There are many others, many other headers that are supported. So this request goes to the backend processes the request, and then the response comes back. So what do we have in the response? Obviously, we have the standard REST API response code. We have the date when, at the timestamp when this request was completed. We may have an E tag, which is typically an MD5 sum of the part that was uploaded. We have this definition of the server that we saw a couple of slides earlier. A request ID that can be used for troubleshooting. So the customer, if some request fails, they're usually asked to specify the timestamp, when was this request sent, and also the request ID, which helps for this server provider or cloud provider to troubleshoot and understand exactly what has happened to the particular request. One important thing in S3 is authorization part, authentication and signature. Right, and folks who have dealt with that are laughing here. So Amazon, when they launched Amazon S3, they came with what they call the Signature V2. And the Signature V2 was discontinued in 2020 by Amazon. We still see about 40%, let's say between 30 and 40% of all requests coming to our cloud, for example, they still use the Signature V2. So it's not exactly discontinued. There are still many clients that use that, which means we have to support it. And then the current authentication mechanism is based on Signature V4. It's in use since 2012. Let's look into this. So this is how it works. The client has to create a canonical request. We'll see what it means. They create a signing string based on the credentials, create a signature, add the signature to the request header, and send this API request to the backend. The backend, whether it's AWS or any other S3 implementation, will receive this request, create again the canonical request on its side, create the signing string, create the signature, and compare with what was sent by the client. If the result is identical, that means that basically the client is authenticated and the server can proceed the request. Otherwise, it will return 403. So what is canonical request? It's basically a set of parameters that have to be transferred to the server. One of them here is signed headers. Signed headers is alphabetically sorted list of lowercase header names that are included in the request. Okay? So let's look on one issue that we have seen with some of the implementations. And in this case, the problem was a combination of issues with min.io and a client side. So we had a case when somebody was sending requests to min.io, and a particular API action called copy object was failing consistently with signature doesn't match. Okay, so it's something that took some time to investigate and understand. The root cause was that both the server side with min.io and the client side, which was the S3 browser in this case, did not exactly follow the spec. So from the server side, min.io returned a mixed set of headers. Some of them were using mixed cases, and some of them were using all lowercase. And on the client side, the S3 browser did not sort them in a case-insensitive way. They actually kept the sorting and kept the case sensitivity. So as a result, that was the request that was sent in. It should be sorted alphabetically, but it was not, because the original request included header names with the mixed cases. So it led to the failure. So this thing is kind of very similar to the spec, not exactly following the spec, and both the client and the server side has issues. Let's look at another problem. So by definition, if we look on the S3 specification, the object name or a key can be up to 1024 bytes long and can include any character, and the following object names can coexist, right? So I can have something like my bucket slash my folder slash object. I can have object and slash at the end. I can have double slash. I can have dot dot. All those names are completely valid from the S3 perspective, and they all can coexist in Amazon. If we look on some of the implementations, again, like min.io or Weka, they all support up to 1024 bytes long. But they interpret slash as a directory. And they use a file system underneath the object storage layer that has its own limitations. So, for example, if you look on min.io, they recommend customers using XFS as an underlying file system. XFS has a limitation of 255 characters per file name, which means that if your object name includes segments between slashes, which is over 255 characters, you cannot store it. Other limitations would include if you have a path that includes double slash or dot or dot dot. Again, it's something that you cannot store on the file system, and those implementations of object storage do not support them. All right, so this is an example if I'm trying to store an object and have double slash in the path. That's the error that I'm getting if the backend is using min.io. Here's another example of a problem. So we talked briefly about the upload part. All right, upload part is part of this mechanism to upload a large object. So when you upload a large object, the recommendation is to break it to parts, and then this leads to a sequence of operations. You do create multi-part upload, you get upload ID, then you send multiple upload requests that send parts of the object, and then you do complete multi-part upload at the end. By definition, if you look on the spec from Amazon, complete multi-part upload is an idempotent operation, which means you can repeat it multiple times, and they all should return the same response code. Should be no difference. And this is an example if I'm doing the complete multi-part upload against Amazon. I point here to the bucket and object name and specific upload ID. I get 200. It was successful completion. If I do again the same command after that, I get 200. The way it works, Amazon implements cache of responses. This cache is valid for, I think, 90 minutes. And within this 90 minutes, if my previous complete multi-part upload finished successfully, a subsequent request for the same operation will return the same result from the cache. This is not the case with min.io. Right, min.io, the first request will finish successfully, and it will eliminate the upload ID. So the upload ID is kind of gone. If I do again the same operation, the same complete multi-part upload, I'll get 404. Upload ID not found. And again, we saw cases when customer applications fail because they work in Amazon. They don't care if the same complete multi-part upload was finished successfully. They try to do this with a different implementation and it fails. Another interesting thing is if you look on the REST API, typically if your request returns 200 success, it means it was successful. This is not always the case with S3. And this is the statement from the spec, right? You may get 200, and the request could fail after that. So it's important not only to look at the response code, which is set at the beginning of the response, but also to the body of the response that may return a failure. So here is an example of a response which returned 200. But later, in the body of the response, it actually saying entity is too large, your upload exceeds the maximum allowed size. So if I'm trying to upload an object or download an object that's bigger than a particular size, I may need to parse the response and see what's going on. This is more for the client side. So the client if you're working on the client implementation, this is something that you should be aware of. Another example, there is an API action called getObjectAttributes. And getObjectAttributes return a particular set of attributes for the object. Right? So if I'm doing this with the Amazon, can specify bucket name, the object name, and which attribute I want to see, I get a response. If I do the same operation with min.io or Backblaze, I'm getting some weird response. In fact, it actually returns header, the first few bytes of the object for whatever reason. Okay. Here is another example, a head bucket operation. I can do things like I can use, specify here who is expected to be a bucket owner, and in this case, because I specified the user that does not exist, the operation fails with 400. If I do the same thing with both min.io and Ceph, yep.
So is it S3 API on Amazon protocol that they publish, and they choose to delineate and do what they want to do? It's theirs, right?
Yes.
So the failings you're pointing out are just different interpretations of
Exactly.
S3, right?
Exactly.
So there's no standards body that AWS publishes. So I don't understand the significance of this, because min.io is a very common implementation of S3, but S3 by design is Amazon's. It's an accidental protocol.
Correct.
Something that's not like seen approved or created a committee.
Yes, exactly. So, and one thing that I want to kind of everybody to aware of that and kind of agree that it is exactly what you're saying. It's not a standard today, right? It's defined and driven by a single company.
Accidental standard.
Yeah, it's de facto standard, you're right. Now, and the question is, there is an example of a different protocol that has a similar story, which is SMB. It came from Microsoft, right?
Yeah, SMB is a complicated mess.
Okay, SMB is a complicated mess. There was a team of folks who did reverse engineering for SMB and implemented Samba and started to proliferate that. And eventually Microsoft endorsed it, and now we have this SMB Plugfest going right next door, funded, not funded, but supported by Microsoft. So can we, and kind of I'm jumping to the end, but what I'm thinking here is, can we get to the same situation with S3? Can we get to the fact that this ability to have a standard set of tests that can ensure compatibility of S3 between different implementations? Can we get to this kind of interop sessions periodically and forum where people can get and bring different implementations of S3 and test compatibility? So that's kind of going ahead of this presentation. But yeah, very good point. Yeah, a few other examples where some particular extensions to requests are not supported, right? Put object with AWS supports different ways to validate integrity of the request, how you can check, calculate different CRCs. Not all implementations support all of those options. So these are all kinds of variables related to API, and they're not documented anywhere. I bet in most of those cases, even the vendors that implemented this protocols may be not aware of these limitations, right? Because again, there are no comprehensive test suites that can address all those nuances, and customers may find that there are cases when customer applications fail when they try to move from one S3 implementation to another. That takes time and frustration. It causes frustration. But it's not only about API. Right? If we look on things that are going beyond API, for example, if we look on performance, right? And I'm comparing here like 4 different implementations of object storage as a service. There are very specific SLAs that, for example, Amazon define when you talk about S3. Right? You can expect 3,500 put operations per second or 5,500 get operations per second per prefix within a bucket. So it's not even per bucket, per prefix, or a specific prefix within the object path. So you may scale out performance within a bucket with number of prefixes, and there are cases when customers are having millions of operations per second to a single bucket. Azure, having the same, kind of, not the same, but slightly different, but also a definition of how you scale out performance, but the numbers are different. Right? Google, if I look on, for example, on Wasabi implementation, they do not define a particular SLA. They are talking about fair use. The more data you store, the more operations per second you may get. And they may come after you and say you're doing too many operations. That's not a use case that is good for us. Same thing you can see with the variability for throughput, right? There are some vendors who provide very specific SLAs and commitment to throughput that they can offer. Up to 100 gigabit a second for a single instance, and aggregated it can go to terabits per second. With Amazon, there are other numbers with a couple of others. There is no data published for obviously on-premises implementations because it varies based on the data center architecture and so on. But that's another thing. When the customer is thinking about moving an application from one backend storage to another, API compatibility is one aspect, performance is another aspect. The third thing that is important is consistency model. Today it's less an issue, right? Because most of the implementations, they are doing the strong consistency, meaning if you do get object immediately after put object, you should see this data, right? There are other implementations. Amazon used to be like that before a few years ago. Some other implementations, they still have this eventual consistency model with object storage. So again, moving from one implementation to another, think about that as the consistency model implemented by the backend also. Okay. So a few things that I wanted to emphasize. S3 is a very complex protocol. There are many nuances if you are dealing with S3 implementations. Remember that if you are a customer looking for transition from one S3 implementation to another, think about potential implications, right? And don't take for granted whatever the vendor claims that it's S3 compatible. Run your own tests. Expect things, small things, right? Most of the things will work fine, but you should be ready for all kinds of potential incompatibilities that will pop up, especially as your usage of the S3 implementation or so-called S3 compatible implementation grows. If you are a vendor that works on the S3 implementation, whether it's on client side or storage side, read through the spec. There are things that not everything is covered in the spec. So try to compare always with Amazon and implement based on that. Test, and test again. And the more compatible you are with S3, the more customer adoption you get, right? This became kind of a de facto standard today. All applications that are developed, they are developed to support S3. And this is what is expected for any object storage implementation. So let me open this to kind of a dialogue, right? Do you have any experience from your side with issues related to S3 compatibility?
Mostly indexing. Mostly the indexing that comes from bad S3 client implementations. So for example, Beam is one of my favorite software that has the worst object storage client on earth.
He's welcome, right?
No. So it's like they're getting the framework better, but the problem with it is effectively every time you do anything, it kicks off a rescan. It kicks off
Rescan.
rescan.
Yeah.
So and if you're using object lock and usability, that gets real fun, and then when you invariably get a customer to do something stupid,
Are you from him?
But, I mean, he's absolutely correct. S3 is an API. It's not, I mean,
fully published API.
I mean, if it's, unfortunately, it's the standard that we have, but it's, until somebody comes along with something better.
Yeah, no, but I think it's actually a good point because I did not talk about that part, which is you may be implementing the API by the book, and maybe you're compatible, but the way you use this API is not optimal. I think that's a very good point, right? So, and we see this as well with all the delete objects coming in and kind of,
Yeah,
and so on.
there are weird use cases. I've seen someone created a bucket and deleted it, like on and off. That's something really not efficient with S3. Create a bucket, have lots of temporary, lots of objects, and delete it. And again. And so, like delete the bucket, not the objects inside, so then you start to do that.
Oh.
And Spark used to, they fixed it, but because S3 in AWS was invention consistent, so every time they would put an object, they would actually read the bucket, which is very hard on cloud
Prefixes
buckets.
are a thing, please use them.
Yeah. It's like they try to make S3 consistent, like at that time it was better consistent, I wanted to fix it. And then AWS changed it. So it's a behavior. But I actually disagree. So basically, what I've seen are users, when they develop applications, in many cases they use AWS S3 Cloud. But then they run the software in production on-premise with our storage itself. And they don't care that S3 is something that AWS defines. They want the same application they hosted that run on AWS S3 one on our storage. And if not, they would go and use another storage.
Yeah.
Even if it's not a standard, and I would say that even industry standards, when I look at other protocols, in the end there will always be variation on what the storage vendor actually provides, because standards are complex, and then sometimes, let's say in the past, we can actually decide that we cannot implement what the spec says despite the fact. So it's up to us to align with our user because that's what they want. And I do wish that AWS had a suite that could validate, so we don't need to maintain our own evaluate.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a very good point, right? That today we see no standard set of tests, and I don't think there is any platform that can be used by different vendors from both client and server to validate the interoperability. It typically happens at the customer side, right? The customer decides, I want to switch from Amazon to Ceph, and then I'll figure out what doesn't work, and see what to do. Any other examples of issues?
More of a question for Amazon. What would you hope them to do or expect them to do to move this forward?
So, first of all, we have a BOF session later today, like I think at 8 p.m. to talk exactly what to do. But what I would like to do is, and again, it depends on, I don't know if we have here anyone who develops S3, whether client or server, we have Ceph, is really, can we build this forum, something similar to what happens next door with SMB, and do this kind of interop work, right? And talk about the implementation. And can we define a standard set of tests that can be used by everyone? And if Amazon can support it, that would be the best, right? And what I'm kind of taking as an inspiration is, again, what's going on with SMB. Initially, Microsoft didn't support this, right? Microsoft was not supporting Samba, and eventually they came out and kind of accepted and embraced it. So maybe it will be the same, right? If we'll find enough people who are interested in bringing this up, we can do it.
And I guess a standard set of tests is different than standard.
Yes.
It's a little bit easier for folks to say, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, at least those things have to be
Yeah.
tested.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and this is exactly what I'm kind of exploring, right? So I'm working with SNIA, To set this as a charter, there is a cloud storage working group within SNIA, and that's what I'm kind of trying to define as the goal for this group. Can we build up this collaboration capabilities for vendors, whether it's client-side or server-side, developing S3? Can we ensure that there is real interoperability between those implementations? Can we maybe get to some kind of certification with list of known incompatibilities, with standard set of compatibility tests? And I think that's something that would be great if we can get to something like that, right? So it's like if we can get next year to this kind of thing at SDC 24, right, similar to what happens today with Microsoft, that would be great. Right.
Will this align with the CDMI work or be part of it? How do you see that?
Okay, so it's parallel with CDMI work. CDMI work is something that is driven today by the Cloud Storage Working Group. And I think that this could be a separate track within the same working group. Right. Yes?
Do you think that for this initiative to be successful, Amazon itself has to actively participate?
I think it would be great. I think it's very important that they join and participate in this. I don't think it's a blocker if they don't. Because again, I'm looking at what was going on with Samba and SMB compatibility, and it started without Microsoft, and later Microsoft joined. But I would love Amazon to be part of it.
Another question. Here, we don't have the other clouds.
What do you mean here?
Like the poster, it's only Amazon. So we all,
Oh, no. This is something that I took a picture yesterday of the poster and made the new logos. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but
I'm saying the main problem between the vendors is, I would say, less the API of the protocol, but actually something you really talk authentication, which is so different everywhere.
yeah.
That's like a mess. I don't know what to say about authentication because it's so different.
This is not published.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, that was another question?
Yes, so have you determined whether the S3 interface is actually Amazon intellectual property? I'm asking that because years ago when I worked for NASA, I ran into a problem like this, and as a civil servant at the time, myself and the agency found itself in court over something with this word. So if you haven't determined whether Amazon is okay with you using their interface, just because you're using it doesn't mean you have a legitimate right to it.
So that's an interesting question. It's not that one company is using it, right? It's publicly available and it's used by pretty much every company today that is doing storage.
Does it have a copyright notice on it?
That's a good question. I think that,
Because those
yeah.
interfaces, if it's copyrighted, I'm not a lawyer, but I spend a lot of time on it. They've asserted their claim, and you're violating their claim. They just may not have pursued you. But that doesn't mean, by not pursuing you, that they've given up their rights. So this is probably a fundamental issue. If you haven't sorted this out, you probably want to check it out.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. So who is here working on S3 implementation as a client or as a server? Okay, great, yeah. So what do you think?
Absolutely fantastic experience. Doesn't help, we might have to implement it, but yes.
What company are you from?
Got it.
Gottenhof? So do you do client or server? Or?
We are clients, we are trying to do the multiple vendors S3 mount
Mhm.
It's been working splendidly, super fast, slightly faster than what I love, very impressed.
Nice. Okay, anyone else? Yeah? Which one, sorry? Oh, ECS, EMC, yeah. Mhm. Yes.
But it won't claim that it changed the S3 API. It says I have a new one
Right.
that I extended. So that's how they get around that copyright.
Yeah. Everybody says S3 compatible. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't believe you made a subset of the presented APIs. And if it's only a subset, you don't know what the full features superset is. So you never get full compatibility unless you have access to the superset.
You have to come across an S3 compatible that like actively chooses to implement SDS. And like, you know, I mean, you look at there's,
It's not complete actually, it's like
I mean,
very hard to explain.
yeah, I mean, in theory, QNAP devices are S3 compatible,
Yeah.
but,
And I think that's what is confusing to many people who don't get into this level of details. They say, yeah, it's compatible. Yeah.
So, but what do you think is in it for Amazon to join? What do they need?
So, no, there are a few things. So first of all, again, you need to talk to them about this, but I was talking to folks who did why Microsoft started to embrace SMB, right? And first thing, they had this demand from Europe especially, that SMB cannot be a single company standard to be used there. And I don't know exactly about S3, but it might be very much the same problem. That's one.
I mean, Microsoft, as soon as they published SMB, it lost the plot. I mean, it became, you know, each iteration, I mean, you're now 15 years after the fact, and they're still mildly trying to kill off SMB version 1.
Yeah.
I mean, it's dead, but it's still in the world.
Yeah.
And it's because they lost the control of it. From AWS standpoint, I would have to imagine that if they turn this into a true standard, then not only do they lose competitive edge by being the one and only way to drive it, but they also find themselves in a situation where they also can't control it.
But
I don't know if that's if they start driving this, I think that they still can control it, right?
no, I don't think they care. Basically, they win, they win by price, but I think we win
Yeah.
Yeah.
performance they can get the scale because we have so much data. They did want to move sometimes for edge or something like that can help them. I can see that if you can do like an edge device that not AWS but can be SP compatible. I don't know if they care enough to participate, but I don't think they're in mind. And in the end, it's their protocol, so they basically can say this is not supported, I don't care. If everybody aligns to what they do, the application out of there,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Yeah. And I think also it might be a good forum for them to talk to. It's not only server side, right? So I care about server, but there are many client applications that struggle with the same problem. So that might be a forum for them to drive this for client. Yeah.
I've seen it from experience, AWS just likes to throw money and into direct relationships against that when they feel it's worth it.
Yeah. Do we have anyone here from Amazon? Don't hide. Okay. Any other thoughts?
Well, I don't think problem, well, of course I cannot find my notes right now, but like Amazon does publish the spec, but sometimes the behavior of the Amazon S3 servers does not match this, the picture.
Yeah.
So like you try to go there and see, oh, what should happen there, and it does something different.
No, you try.
It's like, it's
Yeah.
it's small most of the time, but it gets confusion.
Yeah.
But that's true even for other.
Yeah, like
specs and
SMB, the same
hardware.
for SMB.
Not only NFS, SMB,
Yeah.
NVMe Public.
Yeah.
Even SCSI, not all the, you can see different vendors here, big, small stuff.
Yeah, but that's something that could be, yeah. But if there is a forum that tests stuff, that will help to bring this up. Yes.
So I wasn't going to comment legally. I'm intrigued with the certification comment here. CNN in the past has done work in that space. Getting the test suites documented and defined well enough to use them takes quite a bit of effort to do it and maintain them, and then to execute the program. Are you envisioning a full-blown certification program, or is this more of an interop?
I see this as a journey, right? So it will start from small things, but if we see the support, right, if we have people joining from different companies and taking part of this burden, yeah, we may get to the full-blown certification. But yeah, I realize that it might be too heavy of a task.
So following up, I mean, have you had conversations with, for example, folks that do SMIS?
Not yet. So I was talking about this with the Tech Council, right, and it's...
We'll get discussed with them on Thursday.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay.
How about some of the other object storage providers like MinIO? Could you bounce it off them to see what they would think?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so I was talking to Ceph folks, right? I'm planning to talk to MinIO and whoever else, right? So trying to get to NetApp and yeah, if you are working on S3 implementation, if you're interested in this effort, let's talk about this and you can reach out to me here on this email or after the talk or at the BOF session if you stay here.
I think the client side will be more easier than the service. It's also very important because I see really not very good SP clients that do things.
Yeah, especially with the small companies that kind of.
Yeah, also not support. That we break also on AWS standards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Other questions, comments? Come at 8 p.m. We'll keep talking and have more kind of open discussion, I think. Thank you.